Well, we are extremely honored and happy to have Mark Turner and John Morris from the Stats New Zealand. Mark Turner completed his PhD on the quality of life following a traumatic spinal cord injuries at the University of Otago. He worked as a researcher on mental health at Christchurch School of Medicine, developing national outcomes framework for young people with first episodes of psychosis. He developed outcome frameworks in these two high-need populations, which gave Mark a very good grounding for the evaluation of well-being and the methodological and logistical issues involved in establishing national well-being initiatives. He worked as a social recovery advisor at the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. He developed and implemented the Canterbury Wellbeing Index, and he moved to the Stats New Zealand and has worked since 2018, well, on the 2018 census, before starting to work on the indicators Aotearoa. Tell me if I'm pronouncing it right, which I understand is New Zealand in Maori, no? John Morris is a senior analyst at the same institute, at Stats New Zealand. He has been there for over 30 years and has been involved in a number of roles associated with the production of statistics and the management of the government data system. He has been involved in the development of these indicators bases that I just mentioned from the early 2018. He's currently working on developing indicators that better reflect well-being from the viewpoint of the indigenous population of New Zealand. So we are extremely happy to have you. Please be welcome virtually to Mexico, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen and put up the presentation. John, can people see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
If you could make it just full screen.
Is that full screen?
No, if you could make it full screen, it's not full screen.
It's
and
not
there, excellent. Screen. Now it is.
Oh, good. Okay, great. So thank you, John, and thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to talk today about the work that we've been doing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa is the Māori name for New Zealand, so I'll be using that throughout this talk at times. It's really great to have such positive feedback on our wellbeing work by being asked here to discuss it here today. So it's just a real honour to be here to talk to you today. So just briefly, I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes on the background of the project, looking at how the government came to bring this into being, look at some of the technical considerations of the wellbeing framework and the criteria, the consultation process we worked through to develop the framework, and the review that then went on to put it in place, the website development, and then sort of where to from here. The link to our wellbeing website, which has all our indicators, is at the bottom of the screen here. Can people see my arrow when I move around like this?
Not really.
Okay, so that's okay. The wellbeing website address is there if people want to have a look at this afterwards. So to start with, in early 2018, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, announced that the government's plan for New Zealand to become the first country in the world to embed wellbeing and sustainable development in its budget decision-making process by measuring social, cultural and environmental progress. As you all know, this reflects a wider international practice that's gaining momentum in OECD countries. It was agreed that Statistics New Zealand would be well placed, along with our Treasury, to develop this approach to budget decision making. The idea was that the Indicators Aotearoa project would shine a light on how New Zealand is tracking in a way that moves beyond narrow economic measures. And as we all know, what gets measured gets managed. So that was an important consideration for this change. Indicators Aotearoa was to provide an independent picture of progress through a well-being and sustainable development lens. The consensus was that narrow economic measures do not provide a complete picture of progress. And there's recognition that well-being and sustainable development are multidimensional concepts and require a comprehensive set of measures. The project will give government and business the information to make informed choices about New Zealand well-being with visible trade-offs. And this is really important, that we bring these measures together in one place so that people could see what's happening. Another important aspect of the framework is that it will provide information on the distribution of well-being across the population, so that we can track how different groups are faring. So we can look at inequalities by sex, by ethnicity, by age, by disability status, etc. And finally, the idea is to present the indicated data in a way that makes it easy to understand and use. And this is also for the general public, community groups and other organisations, along with not just government departments. And this image here that I've shown is a word cloud from the topic of subjective well-being that came out of our consultation. So I just thought I'd put that in there to show some of the from the consultation, some of the words that came through on what well-being means to New Zealanders. So this next image is it shows how IANZ, or the Indicators Aotearoa project, fits within informing government priorities. So you can see on the left is our project, the Indicators Aotearoa project, run by Statistics New Zealand, and along with other existing key data, this feeds into our government strategies. So, for example, our child wellbeing strategy that's being run by a Prime Minister uses information from the Indicators Aotearoa project to then report to the government. Also, I put there in red COVID-19, and that's a big change that's come about recently in our reporting needs, and we may get to talk about that later on. Other issues are around the environment. So our Ministry for the Environment uses data from Indicators Aotearoa to help frame up reports for the government to make decisions. And a really important area for us is what's known as the Living Standards Framework, which is run by the Treasury. So they use indicators and data from Indicators Aotearoa to help assist with their reporting for the government. So the idea of Indicators Aotearoa is that it will support wellbeing strategic decision making. It will inform the various policy frameworks that I've mentioned here. You know, these are just examples: the child wellbeing strategy, reporting on the environment, etc., our international reporting commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, human rights reporting, etc. But it's a repository for indicators, and these reporting agencies use our stuff plus other data that they need to make these decisions. The relationship with the Treasury is really important, and the Living Standards Frameworks and the Indicators Aotearoa project serve two very different functions. So the Living Standards Framework is a Treasury tool to support the analysis of wellbeing when developing policy advice for future budgets to determine priority areas for investment. And the Living Standards Framework will draw on our indicators, our data, but may also make use of other data that's out there. So the idea is that our project, our Indicators Aotearoa, is like the repository for a whole lot of data that other agencies within government can then use for reporting to government and also for making decisions on things like the budget and other activities. It's also used, our Indicators Aotearoa project is also used by community groups, local government, and the general public, etc. So this is just putting the priorities out there so that people can make their decisions. We don't make decisions based on the information we provide. We put the information out there for others to use. So I want to talk briefly about the development of our approach and how we came to our set of indicators that we've got on our website and that are used. We started off. This slide shows the process that we used, and that is an ongoing process. So the first thing was to set some ground rules, and these were the framework, the principles, and the indicator criteria. We then engaged with the general public and with technical experts, and then we moved on to the consider and confirm, which is the peer reviewing of what we'd got to from the general public and the sign off. Then number 3 is to source the data that was decided and publish it. And number 4 is to evaluate and to improve. And then that feeds back into changing and updating the Indicators Aotearoa as the times change. And so we can see this is a continual loop. And I think COVID-19 is a particular case where we will be changing the Indicators Aotearoa project based on changing conditions in the country. This process is also being done alongside and in co-design with our Indigenous population Māori, so that although Māori are involved in each of these 4 steps, that they also are involved in an external process alongside it. So if we look at this diagram here, we can see that the 4 stages are ongoing down the left, but at the same time we have partnership and design with our treaty partners, the Indigenous population of Māori, who will work within this process but also alongside it in an ongoing fashion. And I put here a proverb that came out of our consultation, which I think sums up one of the differences between the European Eurocentric viewpoint that we generally run by and the Indigenous viewpoint, which is this proverb that is, what is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. And so in our consultation, this came up many times, that people are very important to Māori culture. So it's just really important to note that within our main consultation process that I'm talking about here, we had ongoing partnership and design with Māori throughout. So when partnering with Māori, the New Zealand's Indigenous population, the government is very aware that the Māori experience of wellbeing in some areas needs to improve. The government of New Zealand is legally obliged under the Treaty of Waitangi to partner with Māori to lift wellbeing for Māori. And this is being done by investigating wellbeing from a Te Ao Māori or a Māori worldview point of view. And this means we need to understand Māori concepts of wellbeing and have a framework to discuss wellbeing and also have indicators that specifically measure Māori wellbeing. So any comprehensive framework for wellbeing in New Zealand needs to consider both the wellbeing of Māori and Māori conceptions of wellbeing. This reflects the status of Māori as the indigenous population of New Zealand and the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Sorry? No, okay, I'll carry on. So it's really important that we make sure that Māori are involved in this process. And I'm now going to turn to the steps that were taken to develop the Indicators Aotearoa project, bearing in mind that the partnership with Māori is being done within these steps and also externally to that. So we started off, this is returning to our stages, and the first stage was to engage to discover. The idea is that we first chose a framework and then set some ground rules for the indicator selection by setting up some principles and technical criteria. These were designed with use in mind, focusing on what is relevant to the New Zealand context. So this is a really important point from the framework that we used, that everything had to be applicable to New Zealand's unique situation with our treaty partners. So a starting point was to evaluate existing frameworks, and these included frameworks from a Māori wellbeing perspective, but we settled on the Conference of European Statisticians recommendations on measuring sustainable development, the CES, which I'll refer to from now on. This was chosen because it represents international best practice, aligns well with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also includes the transboundary aspects. So the three aspects, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, are the here and now, the later, and the elsewhere, meaning the international transboundary aspects. The CES provides the foundation for our framework, but it was tailored to the New Zealand context. And during our feedback, it was criticised as being too Eurocentric by some of our Indigenous reviewers. But we're trying to update that. And for example, our framework includes additional sections on culture and identity, and also the concept of land. And these are topics that are important to New Zealanders. Just quickly, why we use a framework for our indicators. It enables transparent decision making with these visible trade-offs that I've mentioned earlier, removes the blind spots. It provides visibility of data gaps, and I think this is a point I'll return to again and again. It's a single source of agreed key measures, so this means that other people can decide which measure to use for a particular aspect of well-being, and it enables the public to have a transparent view of New Zealand's progress. So the selection of the indicators. It was really important that we set some criteria because of all the different potential indicators we could have chosen. One of the keys was that the indicators should be outcome focused. We determined that this was the right way forward. There was a lot of discussion about whether output indicators should be included, and these are things like smoking prevalence, hazardous alcohol use, things like that. These are intermediate outcomes and contribute to well-being, but are not outcomes themselves. So there were a lot of groups that wanted to include things like hazardous alcohol use in our framework, but we decided that they're outputs rather than outcomes. Another guiding principle was that the indicators should be relevant to New Zealand and Māori specifically. So this is why we added topics like culture and identity. Obviously, these are things that you'll probably be aware of. Movement should be positive or negatively associated with progress, and the evaluative nature of an indicator distinguishes it from a statistic. So it's really important that the movement actually means something clear. So an increase in something is a good thing, or a decrease is a bad thing, or whatever. So there's no misunderstanding. There's a widespread support for a mix of objective and subjective indicators. So this was really important, that we're not just using objective measures. They're looking at well-being. There were measures of people's subjective well-being and things like that included as well. Selection should not be data-driven, and this is a really important point. We looked at what we want to have in our well-being framework, not what the data available already is. So in the end, we have data gaps for about 40% of our indicators. But this is a really important point. We've got the framework and we can clearly identify where the gaps are. And finally, the indicator set should provide a complete picture. The selection criteria, I'm not going to talk too much about these. I think everyone should be reasonably familiar with what these criteria would mean, that they're relevant to the underlying phenomenon, sensitive to change, statistically sound, etc. But that they are able to be disaggregated was a very important point for us, especially when we're examining inequity between regions, by sex, by ethnic groups, and obviously this disaggregation by ethnicity is required by our Treaty of Waitangi, so we can look at different what's going on for different ethnic groups, by age and other things. There was a strong support for the indicators to capture equity and fairness, and the indicators Aotearoa provide an equity lens through breaking down the indicators by these variables in the final product. So they should also, and I'll just sort of mention here that they should be, the technical criteria also meant that they should be intelligible and consistent. So once we had our criteria, these ground rules were in place, we then conducted our public consultation. We had a very tight time frame for this. We set up a national campaign looking at what matters most to you, where we went out to the general public. From the start, we talked about the key user of our wellbeing series as being strategic government decision makers, but we also wanted a much wider potential use for these indicators, and particularly within community groups, local councils, and the general public. So we started with a ground-up approach rather than a top-down one. So in July 2018, we set up a nationwide public consultation process to ask New Zealanders what was important to them. And these results were then used to inform the rest of the indicator selection process. So the picture I have here is a postcard we received. So one of the first things we did was to go out to the public and ask them what they thought was important in terms of well-being. We used postcards for those that were not online. We had an online survey, an online poll, and people could send email submissions in both Māori or English. We received about 2,500 responses on what matters most to people. And there's a full report on the consultation and engagement process on our website. And there's a link there, and these slides will be available afterwards, so you'll be able to click through to that document, which talks in a lot more detail about this process. I just love this one. It's from a kid saying, what's important to me, my favourite animals, life and learning new things, and my family. So it really just sums it up. We then had a public community engagement sessions right across New Zealand. And we went to hard to reach populations. So for example, our Māori Indigenous population. We also went to Pacific populations. So we have a large Pacific community from the Pacific Islands living in New Zealand. We went to school children, went to elderly. It was a huge challenge, and I must say that this whole process was done in 6 months. And we did what we could. This was a government priority. They needed this done quickly for the wellbeing budget. We got some really useful feedback, but we know we could have done more. We should have done more, and we would like to do more. But what we did do was then used to take these, what wellbeing means to the general public, to our next phase, which was our technical workshops. So when we got to our technical workshops, we then looked at the feedback from the general public and got technical experts to talk about what actual specific indicators would measure what matters to people. So we had 19 technical workshops across our main centres. We looked at some workshops were on things like health, some were on things like the environment. We looked at cross-cutting workshops that maybe looked at, say, ethnicity issues or issues for females by males. 19 technical workshops altogether looking at all these various aspects of wellbeing. We then had an indicator selection event where we brought together 200 individuals to look at the 300 indicators that have been developed during the technical workshops and refine those down to a set of 100. Following this, we had a peer review process. This is moving into stage 2, which is our consider and confirm. We had general peer review with national and international experts, and these included international statistics officers, international universities. We had an Indigenous review from the Australian Statistics Bureau and the Canadian Census Bureau, Statistics Bureau, and we had a review from our Māori Indigenous population. Following the review process, the government statistician convened an appraisal panel, which brought together experts on social, economic and environmental areas and a mix of Māori and non-Māori. And we went through each indicator over a 2-day period and came to a final set of indicators that the government statistician then signed off. Moving on to the third phase, which is the source and publish. We then developed a website and started gathering the data for these indicators that were signed off. These processes were being conducted in the background beforehand with things that we knew were going to be used. So we had an idea of some of the measures that would be definitely there. So people were part of our team were already seeking this information out from other agencies or within our own Stats NZ agencies. So we're going to places like the Ministry of Health and gathering data on on health status before the indicators were finally signed off, just so that things were ready. We had an ongoing comms and engagement strategy throughout this process, and then the website was launched in July 2019. So everything that I've just talked about was done in a year. It was definitely a minimum viable product, but we got it done. And now, as I showed you in that earlier slide, the next thing is to get feedback and upgrade our indicators, upgrade our website, and move on to phase 2. So our fourth part of that triangle is to evaluate to improve. As I say, we're looking at continually updating and improving the indicators and getting feedback on the indicators and the website. We're looking at addressing the data gaps. So as I said, when we set up this, it was around what we would ideally like to be measures of well-being rather than what data is currently available for measuring well-being. So we have a significant number of data gaps. So Currently, we have 46 indicators that have no current data source and 16 indicators that don't have an ideal data source. So we have proxy data instead. So for example, we have for our measures of, say, for example, early childhood education, we want to look at the quality of that education. At the moment, we just have a measure of the number of children who attend early childhood education. So that's currently a proxy measure. Looking at these data gaps, we have a data investment plan. So part of the work that John Morris, my colleague, is working on is looking at this data investment plan and what gaps there are and what the whole of government, what gaps there are and what should be funded in terms of data, and he can come to that with insight for well-being into that whole of government data investment plan. We're always looking at continued engagement with all our stakeholders, and this can include the Treasury to make sure that our measures are aligned, local government and other users of the data to find out how we can improve. A big part of it is our improvement in our website, and part of this is being done at the moment by our response to COVID-19. So we've set up a new data portal, which is turning out to be really useful for stakeholders, and we may move our website over to that portal type product, given the feedback we've had from customers. And the other point is around improved partnership with Māori. So they are currently reviewing the indicators that we have and coming up with a set of indicators of their own. And that will be done over the next year, again with the help of my colleague John Morris. So iwi, which is our tribal units, are meeting to discuss what wellbeing means for them and whether what we have in the indicators Aotearoa is sufficient. Currently, we are thinking that it's not, and that will run an additional Māori wellbeing framework alongside ours that asks questions that aren't covered by our general one. So it will be up to Māori to decide that. We are partnering with them, and they will be running surveys and webinars to look at the importance of these components and see whether they are sufficient or whether they wish to develop a suite of Māori wellbeing indicators. But this approach to measuring the nation's wellbeing, being informed by these Indigenous concepts of wellbeing, is really internationally distinctive. And this is where the CES framework that we're basing this on is great, but we are taking it one step further to look at how it works for us. In terms of lessons learned, I think the first thing would be not to rush the consultation that we did. So, as I said, it was a government priority to get this done in time for the budget. A really important point is to consult internationally, and obviously that's what you're doing at the moment, which is great. The other thing that I would say is to, when you set up a framework like this, develop the indicators regardless of the data that you have already, so that you can see what gaps there are. So you don't let the available data dictate what the framework should be. You dictate from the framework what data you would like to see. And the final lesson I would say is that this consultation and engagement with the community and with Māori is really important, so that the people of the country have an ownership of the whole process. So with our engagement and consultation, people can see their handiwork in the final product, and they're engaged more with the project. Just very briefly, because I know you guys will have questions, I'm going to just show the key dimensions of our final framework. So as I said earlier, we have the current wellbeing, future wellbeing, well-being, our transboundary impacts, and then we have a number of contextual indicators. Now, these contextual indicators are really important to interpret the other well-being indicators that we have, but they also affect well-being. So, for example, the production indicators that we have are looking at the country, as the wealth of the country goes up and down. You know, that there's a context around some of the other current well-being that we have. We ended up with 18 topics in current well-being, 4 topics in future well-being, and 6 topics in our transboundary impacts. We have 114 indicators altogether, and as I've already said, 40% have no data currently, but in the here and now, we have 18 topics, and I have a number of slides to look at each of these topics if people are interested, but I'm not going to go through those now. We have 4 topics in the future well-being, so social capital, human capital, physical and financial, and natural capital, and I think these should be very familiar to a lot of you. And we have 6 topics in the transboundary or elsewhere. I'm going to stop here because I think people will have questions. As I already said, we have a number of slides that outline what the actual indicators we use are, the website, and also have some slides on how COVID-19 has changed the way we're working at the moment. But I'm going to hand it back to John at this stage to take any questions.
Right.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Right.
This was extremely interesting. I think your approach has many innovations, and I would like to put my finger in 2 especially now, which is the bottom up approach. No, the fact that you invest a lot in consultations with the general public and with indigenous communities, which is certainly very promising but very challenging, I assume, no, to actually, and I have questions on that, but I'll put my questions in a moment. I'll put the questions of everybody else before, and also the flexibility of your approach seems to me very interesting. The fact that you seem to, rather than getting a huge fixed set of indicators, you seem to construct something which you cannot adapt to specific needs, contingencies, and which changes over time according to demands and to inputs that you receive. So I think that's extremely interesting. So let me put to you some of the questions. John has already given some answers, very useful ones, but let me put them to you. Were you surprised, Gerardo Leiva, were you surprised by the results of the consultations? What was surprising? What was expected since the beginning? Let me put a couple of questions or a few questions, because we have a lot, no? Does the indicators focus in both drivers and outcomes, or just outcomes? No, you mentioned your emphasis in outcomes, and then the question is how if you want to explain the outcomes with your data, how do you do that if you don't have the drivers, no? Delfino asks, what is the theoretical framework that gives support to this measurement approach of well-being? John already mentioned Amartya Sen is a framework. Gerardo asks again, does the whole set of variables result from the consultation or just a fraction? How do you balance the opinions from experts, international and well-being frameworks, with the results of open consultations? Let me stop there, and I think a general question which is of a lot of interest to anybody, I think, is precisely how do you operate this consultation framework and make it compatible with technical requirements, etc. No? How do you, especially you mentioned you go to many communities. I'm sure you obtain therefore many very different suggestions, priorities, or maybe not. Maybe there's a lot of consensus, no? So I think that's a general question which is of a lot of interest. How do you distill that information from the participation and the consultation process?
What we saw the consultation process primarily was to kind of decide we were talking about measuring the right things. We weren't too worried about going to what was the actual measure, but we wanted to know, were the 18 current wellbeing topics the right ones? Is the 4 future ones, using 4 capital approach, the right way to go? What do you think about transboundary? In general, there wasn't a lot of surprise. I think I've already answered the question. One thing that did surprise us, we got a very strong feel about the value of animals and pets in wellbeing. We haven't yet found a way to put that into our framework, but that came through quite strongly. When we got into the actual consultation, I would say generally confirmed we were on the right track, and our framework we selected was going to cover what we wanted to cover. When we got into some of the workshops, things changed. Mark mentioned we had culture and identity. We actually had them as one topic together. And when we got into the workshops, we found that culture and identity are just, certainly from a New Zealand context, they are related, but they are also different. And we actually chose to actually split those 2 apart and treat them as separate aspects. One thing that we want to do, we haven't done yet, is that we also realized a little bit late in the piece that we really want to have a view of wellbeing from a family whānau, which is the Maori view for family, but it's not quite the same as family. It can be a little bit, it's more of an extended family view. We want something that goes with that, and we haven't yet done that. So it was too late for us to bring those in. We didn't want to rush it, but we are working to add that one in as well. The key point I would say I got from the consultations, particularly the workshops, was that, and we haven't got there yet, but that wellbeing is fundamentally a community-based thing, and that we need to be able to drill down to that community level. We haven't got there yet, but that's where community, that's where it really makes its value. And the example that resonates with me was one of our cross-cutting workshops, a non-government agency that does social services in one of our other cities, basically said, what I want you to do is give me the information so I can prove to the people who have the money that I have the answers to the problems. So he wants to be able to, the problem to be defined at a low enough level, they can say, here's the problem, and then say, we have a solution to it.
Okay. Mark mentioned that there was a lot of emphasis in particular on the Maori perspective, no? And yep, that even the Maori conception of well-being, you tried to come to that. How did that change the traditional Western SEN, for example, Amartya Sen type of capability conception of well-being? What was the effect, the actual effect on your indications?
Well, we haven't quite got there yet. We're working to bring it in. I don't think it affects, say, a SEN's view of what well-being is. That resonates quite strongly, I think, with Maori communities. I'm not Maori myself, so I'll have to be careful how I say that. And what it came in a little thing. I mean, the CES kind of petition, for instance, CES petitions current well-being and future well-being as separate parts. You use things that have your current well-being. You want to ensure that you're passing something on. This stuff well-being left for the future generations. The Te Ao Maori view doesn't have that. It's all one. One of the people we're working with to develop these indicators, Dan Takanoa, basically says it's past, present, and future all in one. That's how Maori see well-being. You can't split it up. The past affects the current, affects the future, and it's a more continuous, holistic view of things. So it's that type of view we're trying to get, and we're trying to see if that's the view of the world you have. Are there specific things you want to be measured in a well-being suite?
Okay, let me put a few other questions. One, which I think is very relevant, is how do you prioritize? No, you have a lot of information from your consultation process, and then you have to throw a lot of things out, I guess, and prioritize the most relevant. No. Yeah. whether the fact that you are changing and adapting, if we understood correctly, that the flexibility of your approach, which is very valuable, presents problem of comparability in time, no? If you innovate a lot, you might have problems of that you have better and better indicators, but you cannot have a history, no?
Yeah. Can I deal with the prioritization one first?
Sure.
If I'm honest, I would say not everyone agrees with the 100 and something indicators we came up with. There are some people who would have liked other ones in there, and they probably still are not, they would have a different set. What we tried to do, the two key bits we did to give us that we could actually say we have engaged in a process we think will come up with the right prioritization of the indicators was, Mark mentioned the indicator selection event, which was where we fed back the results of our workshops, and the part of the workshop was suggesting what indicators you wanted. And then we'd gone through and we'd applied our criteria that Mark mentioned earlier against those suggestions. And this is where we got a bit of flack, because some people were suggesting what we consider to be intermediate output in the indicators, and we would say, well, it's a good statistic, but it doesn't fit the criteria. So we fed this back prior to the indicator selection event to all the participants in terms of a spreadsheet, which had by each of the topics. We had green, orange, and red. Green meant we think, our view was, yeah, that's what we want. Orange was, we're not sure, we want your feedback on it. Red was, we don't think this meets the criteria. And so we got people they could think about it and come in. And we had the indicator selection event. We ran it for a day. We went through every single topic and every single one of the 299 indicators we arrived at was up for suggestion. There were other ones who were suggested at the event. And so we got through a process where we worked through it. We ran it in 3 streams. We worked through it. We got the feedback, and we kind of made some decisions on that. And that was the kind of opportunity for people who wanted to have their say to have their say. As I say, I can't guarantee we got consensus across the board, but that was a first step in kind of getting a prioritization that wasn't just stats picking and choosing. Yes, we had some leadership role, but we weren't the final authority on it. The second important step was the panel at the very last thing, where they were people who had been independent of the process. There was one Stats NZ rep on the panel, but she had not been part of the process. And we basically gave them the set of indicators. We gave them the feedback we'd had from the indicator selection event. We gave them the feedback we've had from the various peer reviews. They had 2 days to go through all the indicators and make changes. And they made some minor changes around the edges. But that allowed us, and their job was to make a series of recommendations to the government statistician about what the indicator sets should be, which we assisted that, but we weren't part of it. So that allowed us to say, we've been through a process where in the final decision was made by the government statistician. He has the statutory authority to, she had the, actually it was a she then, she has the statutory authority to do that, which she did, but she did it based on recommendations from an independent process. And that's about the best we could come up with.
Excellent. Another question has to do with the subjective well-being measurement, no?
Yep.
Why you decided to include that, and what kinds of questions you included. And I would like to add to that also what questions you included to measure the other very general things like culture and identity. Land, yep. I guess it's pretty straightforward, unless you included more than, for example, quality of land in Mexico is an issue. Now we have good land information, but quality is very heterogeneous. Yep. So that's a measurement question. Now let me get a few more. Do you put a lot of emphasis in measuring inequality across all dimensions of well-being that you defined? Do you put a lot of emphasis in measuring inequality in income and wealth? I guess there are a trade-off, no? Yeah. Probably. Yep. Okay. What was the criteria to select the people in the workshops?
That was self-selected. We kind of made people aware of it. sent out people who were holding the workshops. If you want to turn up, let us know. You can come in.
Okay. And then a very good question is, of course, as you mentioned, you generated a huge amount of indicators, no? Much like the SDRs, no? Which may make it very difficult to make sense of it, no? So how did you make the decision, no? On what is the optimal number of complexity in your informational system, no? And I would add to that whether you are using synthetical indicators, not to aggregate, or is it you just generate a whole battery of indicators as a vector?
All right. If you mean we don't have any one indicator of well-being, we're not indexing the series of indicators to form one indicator. We decided not to go on that path. We appreciate for some people they find that useful, but our view is that because it's such a diverse thing, you want to see the variety of things. And if you have a one indicator, an index indicator, the first thing you ask is, so what's driving it? And then you start to dig into it. So we thought that was a little bit of a counterintuitive move. We accept other people have a different view about that. And there is one of our universities, there's an academic who's trying to use our data to build that one indicator. And we're happy for him to do that job rather than us. Sorry, that was the one about that one.
The one about subjective well-being
subjective.
And identity, culture.
Yeah, subjective. We actually had quite a bit of support for having the balance of subjective and objective measures. The only group that had a strong aversion to having subjective measures in there was our business. There's a representative group of business who we want objective, we're interested in the economy, we want things that are hard facts. They were the one dissenting voice who said we don't really trust the subjective measures. Most of the other discussion was you want a balance of both. And one example that came up quite a bit was the bit about crime. We have objective measures in crime in our police stats crimes. We have a subjective measure about people's perception of crime. Interestingly, the people who have the greatest fear of crime are those who actually experience the lowest rate of crime from the crime stats. So that's where we think it perhaps indicates the value of having both objective and subjective measures together. You get an interesting picture, a bigger picture by having them there. Generally, we think that balance is the way we think the world's going. We're quite comfortable with that. I would say the majority of people in New Zealand would agree with us, but not everybody.
Okay.
Could I just add, John, that a lot of the subjective measures are coming from our general social survey. So that's run by Stats NZ on a large sample of 20,000 people. And that's done so that we can break those subjective measures down by our ethnicity, age, etc., so that we can actually look at those things by equality. So it's not just a overall measure, subjective measure. We're only using measures that can be broken down by these equity things that were mentioned earlier. One other question that I heard you ask right at the start of this session was around our measures of land and things like that, and I just wanted to put in that. Yeah,
land, culture, and identity. No, how you?
So for land and things, those are actually some of our biggest data gaps. So around our natural capitals is where we have some of the largest gaps, but that's where we're doing a lot of our biggest work at the moment. So there are still gaps at the moment, but one of the things of putting them in a framework such as this was to show those gaps.
Okay, and so in addition to that, what are the main gaps you actually identified? Because you put a lot of emphasis in that, no? In working not from the data not using the data to restrict yourself, but to work the other way, no? So what are the main challenges you identify in terms of information you would like to have, but you couldn't at the moment?
We actually specified 4 actual equity measures. We have justice equity, education equity, can't think of the other 2. There's
health equity.
Yeah, and that's the gaps. And so there's a bit of work we have to do about that, because it's really about what's the distribution and what's the experience of outcomes across those services. So that's one area. Mark's already mentioned that we need to do a lot of work in the environmental statistics area. And in a lot of cases, it's not that the data is not available. In some cases, you have lots of data, but I've mentioned the same thing, but measuring it slightly differently. So it's more a bit of actually deciding, agreeing on what is the measure you want to have and getting agreement on that. So you can actually say, here's the official measure. How does it do? Really, we have a lot of measures where we measure the incidents. Mark's already mentioned early childhood. We also have how social connections. We know people say the amount of social connections we have, but we haven't got any information about the quality of that social connections. So that's another area we want to kind of get a bit nuance about. It's not just that you're connecting with someone, but what are you doing and what's the value you get from that connection? It's the kind of areas we want to move into. Trying to think off the top of my head. Certainly, yeah, we did have a lot of gaps. Our minister, the Minister of Stats, who commissioned the work for us, was comfortable with that. He, as Mark has said, he thought it was a good way to highlight gaps in the statistical system that we have. That work has kind of morphed into what Mark mentioned earlier, the data investment plan, where we're trying to develop a 10-year plan for the government to invest in its data system around what are the things it needs to invest in. So that's where those kind of, hopefully, those gaps will be filled and addressed. Now, we know that in our next iteration of the General Social Survey, there's a couple of new questions we've added in which will fill a couple of gaps. Unfortunately, that survey's been delayed by a year because of COVID-19, but we will get those eventually. So there's a high-level, big investment way of filling the gaps, and then there's the small little, we know we can do this, make this change, add an extra question into here and get some information that way. So it's kind of both a macro and a micro view about filling the gaps.
Okay. One obvious logistical question is whether you are building an informational system based on a lot of specific surveys, separate surveys, or you are actually trying to do a heroic survey which includes all those questions and which would take, I don't know how many hours of interview. No? What are you trying to do? Which of those?
We will run we'll use whatever data is available. So we don't rule out using administrative data to fill these gaps. And some of the information we already have probably comes from administrative data. In terms of surveys, there are 4 surveys that Stats NZ does, household surveys. There is our Ministry of Health does one, and our Ministry of Justice do one. And we probably won't add any new surveys to those 4. What we might do is work as a collaborative across government to try and get additional questions put in and make sure that, well, there might be collection of the same thing, that they're collected in the same way, but also kind of partition out responsibilities so that information collected is across those kind of suites, so we get the coverage that way. So it's a bit of it's not one big survey to rule them all, it's using multiple surveys and other data sources to kind of fill the gap. Okay.
There is another question. Are there specific goals, SMART, for people that are in charge for environment, such as the Minister of Environment in New Zealand? Or what kind of commitment do they have after the results of this exercise? I'm not sure I understand very well, but
we have some goals from some of our international agreements around environmental reporting that we must deliver on. So that's one thing that kind of forces and environmental reporting is jointly led by Stats NZ and our Ministry for the Environment, and we have a collaborative approach to doing that. So that's one thing. What we do have is we have an independent parliamentary commissioner for the environment whose job it is to report independently to Parliament around what's happening in the environment area and where it needs to be improved. And late last year, he produced a report which highlighted very much the kind of data gaps, and it actually focused more on the infrastructural gaps, i.e. the data's there, but it can't be shared, it can't be accessed. And so that's kind of driving the main response about how we're going to work in the environmental area to improve the information needs. So it's there. It's certainly I'm aware that the Parliamentary Commissioner was aware of IANZ and had input into it, but it was an independent process to that. That's part of his role, is every 3 years, I think, is to report on the status of the environment and the status of how it's going. And he basically said, I can't report where I want to because I haven't got the data. And so he made a very scathing report saying this needs to improve.
Okay.
John, can I answer a question that was asked before that I think is really important that we clarify? And that was around the ability of the indicators Aotearoa framework to change over time. Mm-hmm. We don't expect it to change a lot. What we're saying is that it's got the flexibility to be reviewed every couple of years and say, right, well, things have changed. We may add a new question, we may take one out because of new things. But having said that, we're now in the time of COVID-19 where things are changing rapidly and we have new data requirements that have meant that we've changed unexpectedly. So we have the ability within this framework to do that and then return to a more indicators Aotearoa based framework once the COVID-19 crisis is over. So we are flexible, but we didn't think we were going to be this flexible. So I just wanted to add that in. You asked a question before about what happens when we, can we look at this over time? We expect most of our measures to remain over time. We just want to tinker around the edges. So it's not about changing a lot, it's about changing to make sure we reflect New Zealand society and what our what people think is important to well-being.
Sure, excellent.
And certainly COVID-19 has asked questions of us about whether our assumption around focusing on only output measures was the correct one. So we have been, because COVID-19 has been focusing more on what we call those intermediate outcomes in terms of what it wants to report on. So it has, asked us to review that basis.
And how have you responded to COVID-19 specifically? Have you done special surveys?
Yes. What's happened?
And by what means? No, by phone or by?
What happened was a lot of I already mentioned there were certain agencies that already had other surveys in, the health, justice. They undertook what they called pulse surveys, where they would target a small part of their existing survey, and they would answer them some very quick, sharp questions on impacts of COVID-19 on them. And what we, Stats Instead, developed is we developed a COVID-19 portal where we put a lot of data. And a lot of the data in that at the moment is very economic focused, because it was the key focus, is what's the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. But we are working to see if we can add some of the data from these other pulse surveys to that portal to kind of give it an indicator about what's been happening during COVID-19. We had a six-week lockdown, effectively. What was the impact of that? We, and Mark or Chris can come in with a bit more detail to this, but we see COVID-19, and particularly COVID-19, to be fundamentally a well-being issue. It's affecting well-being. So we're approaching our response to it from a well-being basis. Going forward, we want to start reporting on the recovery from COVID-19 on a well-being basis. And we probably will do that via extension to this COVID-19 portal. However, the portal itself has some nice features that we want to perhaps incorporate in how we communicate our well-being responses over time. So while we currently have a website that's a fairly flat, very static structure, the COVID-19 portal is a bit more dynamic and has some other functionalities. So over time, we expect we will change the way we present our information to people based on what we've learned from our response to COVID-19. Chris, you got anything to add?
No, John, I think you covered that really well. We're looking to the COVID-19 data portal has been a real success here in New Zealand. So we're looking to take the lessons learned from that and the success from that and apply it to an IANZ wellbeing perspective. So we've got some funding here over the next 3 years, and we'll be looking to see how best to spend that in order to achieve that.
Excellent. Let me make a final question because we are reaching the end of our meeting. But unless I receive any other questions, one is the use of administrative data. How you whether you use it, for example, two big issues in Mexico, among many others, are how you measure income at the top, for example, of the income distribution. How do you measure capital income, things which you could measure through the tax system, and how you measure benefits and taxes, from public interventions, whether you do that through administrative data, and how you combine those data with survey questions.
Okay.
How do you do that?
First answer is we also had trouble getting good information on high-level income and wealth. So we don't have a magic bullet for that one. It's an issue here as well. We have invested a fair bit of Stats NZ in what we call our integrated data infrastructure, which is a place where we put a lot of admin data from our benefit systems, from our tax systems into this data set at unit record level. It's anonymized. We then bring in the results of all of our surveys, again, anonymized into that thing. And then because you can come up with possible links between the admin data and the individual based on certain defining criteria. And so we do that, but it's still anonymized. You don't actually know who the person is, but you've got a good suspicion that this tax record from this person is also the same person or someone very similar to them who's answered this survey. And so,
but you don't have a common identification number or something.
We're not allowed to use a common identification number.
Okay.
What we do is we develop one. We have a one-way algorithm that develops an ID number within that system, but you don't know anything about who that person is. It's just a number. So we're not allowed to use. Everyone has a tax number in New Zealand. We're not allowed to use that for direct matching. We have to use other methods to do it.
But you do try to make a one-to-one matching or just a statistical?
It's a statistical probabilistic
match. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. And wealth, finally, how do you measure? Do you include wealth in your? I guess you do, no?
I think yes, we do have wealth. It's perhaps one of the areas we need to move on. Like all countries, we have a lot of emphasis on income rather than wealth, and so that's an area we need to improve our measurement of. And just outside of this work, we are doing some work to try and get the macro view of wealth and the micro view of wealth to kind of actually equate. We haven't quite got it yet, but we're trying to. Once we've got that completed, we might be able to improve the kind of statistics we have in the indicator set for wealth.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark, John. This has been extremely useful for us, and I hope we keep in contact.
Yes.
Yes.
Feel free to email us any questions or anything like that, or anything we haven't answered. We'd be happy to do so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Have a nice Saturday in New Zealand.
Yeah.
The sun's just coming out.
Congratulations for your COVID strategy. I think it's the most effective in the world, probably. By the numbers you have, no? You're in comparison to us, certainly.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us along. It's been great. Bye.
It was a pleasure. Bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Todos. Muchas gracias.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego a todos.
Hasta luego.
Semana.
Gracias.